This is a modern fable. It is not a story of ancient kingdoms or enchanted forests, but of glass towers that scrape the sky and silent agreements that move billions across continents. It is a story to remind us that in a world that worships the roar of success, the most profound truths are often spoken in a whisper, and that true honor is not what is displayed in the light, but what is defended in the shadows. It does not say that. The four words were not shouted, they were not aimed, they were simply spoken, and yet they sliced through the gilded air of the private dining hall like a shard of ice. Conversation, a low, confident hum of finance and futures, ceased instantly. A crystal glass of vintage Bordeaux, halfway to the lips of an investor from Dallas, hovered, forgotten. Every head around the massive mahogany table turned. 12 faces, a constellation of power and privilege, shifted their focus from the sleek, leather-bound folder at the head of the table. Some were merely curious, their eyebrows arched in mild amusement at this unexpected break in the evening's choreography. Some were confused, their minds still catching up to the sudden, jarring disruption. And one, the man at the very head of the table, was incandescent with a fury so cold it burned. The voice had not come from a lawyer, hunched over his notes with a gold-plated pen. It had not come from a board member, eager to prove his worth with a sharp observation. It had certainly not come from the nervous, sweating translator hired for the evening, who looked as if he wished the floor would swallow him whole. It had come from the corner of the room, from the periphery of power, from the place where the help was meant to stand. Alara Vance stood perfectly still, her right hand clutching a silver tray of unopened wine bottles, her knuckles white against the polished metal. Her posture was impeccable, a testament to years of practiced invisibility in rooms just like this one. But her eyes were not downcast as they should have been. They were level, and they were locked on the folder of documents that had just been passed to the distinguished Japanese guest of honor, Mr. Akira Sato. The folder that held a $500 million deal. The folder that held a devastating lie. And she, a 24-year-old waitress in a starched white apron, had just exposed it. Alara was not supposed to speak. She knew that with every fiber of her being. Everyone in that room, from the busboys nervously clearing plates in the background to the billionaire orchestrating the entire affair, knew that. She was there to serve silently, swiftly, invisibly. She was a ghost in a uniform, a pair of hands to pour wine and clear glasses, her presence acknowledged only by its absence if a need went unmet. But when your grandfather, a man who saw the best and worst of humanity in the Pacific theater of World War II, teaches you a language most people don't expect you to know, you listen differently. And when your mother, a woman who has worked 2 jobs her entire life, raises you to believe that silence in the face of deceit is a betrayal of everything you are, you don't just stand there when the moment comes. You speak. Even when you know your voice is about to shake the room, and perhaps your entire life, to its very foundations. Alara Vance was used to being underestimated. It was a fundamental part of the uniform she wore, as essential as the polished black shoes and the discreet name tag that identified her only by her first name. At 24, she possessed a quiet, unassuming beauty, smooth, coffee-colored skin, warm almond eyes that saw everything, and a graceful, almost poetic way of moving that had been honed by years of navigating crowded, expensive rooms without making a single misplaced sound. But in the white tablecloth world of Manhattan's elite, they did not see poetry. They saw a uniform. They did not hear a mind at work. They heard silence. She worked at the Velvet Ivy, a rooftop restaurant where the panoramic view of the city was rivaled only by the astronomical prices on the menu. It was a place where celebrities came to be seen but not bothered, where world-changing deals were whispered over Wagyu beef, and where someone like Alara was expected to be 3 things: helpful, invisible, and utterly replaceable. The rules were unwritten but absolute, absorbed into her bloodstream over hundreds of shifts. Don't speak unless spoken to. Keep your tone friendly but never familiar. A perfect, placid surface that revealed nothing. If a guest makes a crude joke, offer a small, non-committal smile that dies before it reaches your eyes. If they call you sweetheart or girl instead of your name, let it slide off you like water. When a man in a suit worth more than your car snaps his fingers to get your attention, you respond as if he has paid you a compliment. And the compliments, when they came, were often dressed like daggers. "You're so articulate," a banking executive had once told her, his surprise so poorly veiled it was an insult in itself. He had meant it, she knew, as a genuine compliment, which only made the sting of his low expectations sharper. "You have such lovely features." For a black girl, a socialite had whispered to her friend, though loud enough for Alara to hear, as if bestowing upon her a great and charitable favor. One night, a tech mogul from Silicon Valley, drunk on success and expensive scotch, leaned in conspiratorially. "You know, with that walk, you'd be perfect for a music video. Ever consider it?" He saw her grace not as an extension of her character, but as a commodity to be filmed and sold. Alara had smiled, nodded, and walked away, every single time. But she remembered. Oh, she remembered. She remembered the way their eyes flicked over her, not seeing a person but a character they had already written into their script of the world. Not someone with a degree in linguistics from Hunter College. Not someone who spent her free time translating 17th century Japanese poetry for the sheer love of the words. Not someone sharp or observant or multilingual. Just a pretty face in a world that saw color before it ever saw character. They did not know she spoke Japanese fluently. They could never have imagined it. They did not know her grandfather, Samuel Vance, had served in the Pacific during World War II. He had returned from the war a changed man, not hardened by the conflict but softened by a profound understanding of shared humanity. He had seen boys, not monsters, on the other side of the battle lines. And so, in the quiet years that followed, he had dedicated himself to learning the language of his former enemies. He taught it to Alara as a way to honor them, to bridge a gap that history had violently carved. To understand a man's heart, Alara, he used to tell her, his voice raspy with age as they sat on his porch in Queens. You must first understand his words. War teaches you to see uniforms. Language teaches you to see people. She had studied quietly, diligently, with his old, dog-eared books, with podcasts she listened to on the subway, and with stacks of his carefully preserved letters from a Japanese friend he had made after the war. She did not study for a job, or for a line on a resume, or for show. She studied for herself. She studied to feel closer to the quiet, dignified man who had taught her that integrity was the only currency that truly mattered in the world. He had passed away 2 years ago, but his lessons were the very bedrock of her soul. So, no, Alara Vance wasn't just the help. She was the keeper of her grandfather's legacy. And on this crisp autumn night, in a room shimmering with ambition and arrogance, the world was about to find that out. Because when the truth finally cracks the surface of a polished lie, it rarely comes from the place you expect. It comes from the shadows. And tonight, it came from the girl in the white apron holding a tray of wine, the one person in that entire room they had all forgotten to fear. Sterling Thorne did not simply walk into a room. He conquered it. At least, that was the narrative he projected, a story told through the flawless cut of his custom suits, the confident cadence of his voice, and the unwavering belief in his own manifest destiny. For the most part, the world eagerly believed him. Tonight was no different. The private dining hall at the Velvet Ivy was not merely a room he had reserved, it was a stage he had set. The single, imposing mahogany table was his throne. The 12 supple leather chairs held his court. The white orchids in tall, minimalist vases were silent symbols of a victory already won. Even the jazz trio in the corner had been instructed to play just loud enough to be impressive, but not so loud as to interrupt the closing of a deal. It was all a carefully calibrated performance of power. He entered with his entourage, 2 stone-faced lawyers who flanked him like loyal guards, his executive assistant, whose eyes seemed permanently attached to the glow of her iPad, and the translator, Julian, who followed a step behind, looking pale and insignificant. Sterling wore a navy suit so dark it was almost black, tailored to perfection. His tie was a slash of crimson, his power color, sharp, deliberate, calculated. He was the kind of man whose smile was a strategic weapon, reserved for magazine covers and moments of absolute victory. To the world, Sterling Thorne was the American dream personified. Ivy League graduate, a fixture on Forbes 30. Under 30, a self-made billionaire in the cutthroat world of fintech before he had even seen his 35th birthday. He was a media darling, armed with a trademark smirk and a Rolodex filled with the private numbers of senators and CEOs. But behind the closed doors of rooms like this, He was a different man, colder, sharper, hungrier. Alara had served him a few times before and had seen glimpses of the man behind the carefully constructed mask. He never made eye contact with the staff. He never used names. He just snapped his fingers and issued commands. Sparkling water, room temperature, not cold. This steak is medium. I asked for medium rare. Take it back. He treated the service staff not as people, but as extensions of the room's furniture, functional and inanimate. Tonight, his target was Akira Sato, a quiet, reserved billionaire from Japan. Mr. Sato's family holding company was a bastion of old money, an empire of logistics, real estate, and technology built over generations. He was a man of legacy, not flash. And Sterling needed his money. The plan was brutally simple. Charm Sato, present the seamlessly translated contract, close the deal, and walk away with a $500 million injection into Maxwell Capital's new Asia expansion. Everything had to be perfect. The only problem was Mr. Sato's caution. His people were thorough, believing in meticulous, transparent, line-by-line reviews of dual-language contracts. They wanted everything equal, everything honorable. So Sterling did what he always did when faced with a roadblock. He created a shortcut, a hidden path through the tall grass that only he knew existed. He had hired a freelance translator, Julian, a man with a solid reputation but, as Sterling's private investigators had discovered, a mountain of gambling debt. The instructions, delivered in the stark, soundproofed quiet of Sterling's corner office a week prior, had been precise. Make the English version sound like a standard, open-ended partnership, Sterling had said, his voice a low, confidential murmur, vague but reassuring. In the Japanese version, however, I want some protective language. This protective language was a masterpiece of deceit, a legal time bomb hidden in plain sight. It stipulated that if the Asian market experienced a downturn of more than 5%, even for reasons entirely unrelated to their joint venture, Sterling's firm would gain temporary administrative control over all of Nakamura Holdings' blank U.S.-based assets. Temporary, of course, was a conveniently undefined term. Control, however, was not. It was legal sleight of hand, just ambiguous enough to slide past a cursory glance by an American lawyer unfamiliar with the nuances, but just precise enough to act as an inescapable trap for Mr. Sato. He'll never read the fine print, Julian, Sterling had assured, sliding a thick envelope of cash across his glass desk. The sound it made was a soft, satisfying whisper. $20,000 for your discretion. They trust the English version. It's a matter of honor for them. He had smirked then, a flash of genuine, predatory amusement, a concept they value far more than we do. The documents were now printed on thick, ivory-colored paper, bound in expensive leather, and delivered to the restaurant that afternoon. They looked, felt, and smelled like integrity itself. They were the final course in a carefully choreographed performance of trust. What Sterling never imagined, what his monumental arrogance could never conceive, was that the one person in that room who would actually read the Japanese version and understand its venomous implications would be the server bringing the wine. He had accounted for lawyers, for analysts, for Mr. Sato himself. But he had never, not for a single second, accounted for the invisible girl in the white apron. The evening had been a symphony of polished perfection, right up until the moment it shattered. Alara moved with the practiced grace of someone who had mastered the art of being present but unseen. She floated between the side tables and the main table, refilling water glasses with a silent turn of the wrist, responding to subtle nods, anticipating every need before a word was spoken. She had done this 1,000 times. She had learned to disappear in plain sight, a skill born of necessity. But some people never let you forget who they think you are. As she approached the main table to offer another bottle of the expensive Cabernet that had been selected for the evening, one of Sterling's guests, an oil investor from Dallas, with a booming voice and a heavy gold watch that caught the light with every gesture, looked her up and down with a lazy, appraising smirk. His voice was a low drawl, just loud enough to carry across the table to his neighbor. "She walks like she's on a runway," he chuckled, taking a slow sip of his wine. Another guest, a hedge fund manager with cold, reptilian eyes, chimed in without looking up from his plate. "Bet she couldn't find Japan on a map, though." Sterling laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was a sharp, dismissive sound, and punctuation mark of agreement. "She's not here to think," he said, waving a hand in Ilara's general direction as if she were a piece of decor. "She's here to pour." Ilara kept moving, her face a mask of professional neutrality, her eyes fixed forward on her task. She had trained herself not to react to such comments. Reacting was a luxury she couldn't afford. It would mark her as difficult, sensitive, unprofessional. Silence was strength, she had always told herself. It was armor. But then, as she neared Mr. Sato's place at the head of the table, she saw it. The leather-bound contract was open, its pages lying flat to display both the English and Japanese text side by side. Sterling's translator had just finished his brief, reassuring summary. Mr. Sato was nodding politely, his pen resting beside the signature line. It was an accident, a trick of the light and timing. Ilara's eyes, drawn by the instinct of a linguist, scanned the vertical lines of Japanese characters. Most of it was standard legal jargon. She recognized phrases for mutual agreement, terms and conditions, confidentiality. But then one line, in a clause deep within the 7th paragraph, snagged her attention with the force of a physical hook. It was a specific, slightly archaic legal term, Guanliken no Jundu Kanriken no Jodo. The phrase jolted her, sending a tremor through her hand. She hadn't seen it in years, not since her grandfather had been explaining an old military document from the post-war occupation to her. He had been very specific about its meaning. It didn't just mean control or management in a collaborative sense. It meant a formal, binding transfer of administrative authority. It was a word of acquisition, of conquest. A word used when one entity fully subsumes the power of another. It was a word that had no place in a partnership agreement supposedly built on mutual trust. Time seemed to fold in on itself. The low hum of the jazz trio in the corner faded into a distant buzz. The clinking of cutlery and crystal disappeared. Her breath caught in her throat. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of panic and duty that echoed in her ears. She could see Mr. Sato, a man of quiet dignity who reminded her so much of her grandfather, about to sign away his company's autonomy based on a lie. Her mind raced, a chaotic storm of fear and responsibility. "Stay quiet. You'll be fired. You need this job. Mom needs the insurance." "It's not your business. These are billionaires. This is not your world. They will ruin you." A word from Sterling Thorne and you'll never work in this city again. But another voice, deeper and stronger, rose to counter the terror. It was the voice of Samuel Vance, calm and steady from her memory. It was the voice of her own conscience, the one her mother, Evelyn, had so carefully nurtured. "Never let them make you small, Ilara. Your silence is a gift. Don't give it to people who don't deserve it." She looked at Sterling Thorne, his face alight with the thrill of the impending kill, a predator closing in on his prey. She looked at Mr. Sato, his face a mask of polite trust, completely unaware of the trap beneath the surface. The armor of her silence, which had protected her for so long, suddenly felt like a cage. And so, for the first time in her life, she broke the cardinal rule of her existence. She let the words out before fear could pull them back and lock them away forever. It does not say that. The silence that followed Ilara's words was not merely an absence of sound, it was a presence. Heavy, absolute, and suffocating. Sterling Thorne's head whipped toward her, his charming facade melting away like wax held to a flame, revealing the cold, hard fury beneath. His eyes, which moments before had been crinkling with a confident smile, narrowed to dangerous slits. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice dangerously low, each syllable a perfectly polished stone of menace. The whole table was now staring at her. The investor from Dallas looked amused, a smirk playing on his lips, as if this were some unexpected dinner theater. Sterling's lawyers looked horrified, their faces paling in unison. But Mr. Sato, the man at the center of it all, remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes fixed on Ilara. Ilara stepped forward, her tray now forgotten on a nearby stand. Her voice, though quiet, was steady and clear, cutting through the thick tension. "The Japanese clause," she said, gesturing with her chin toward the open folder on the table. "It says something very different from the English translation. It's not just a matter of wording. It's fundamentally misleading." Sterling stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the polished marble floor. The sound was violent in the stillness, a raw expression of his rage. His tone dropped an octave, dripping with a venomous condescension meant to crush her. You are a waitress. You pour wine and you keep your mouth shut. That is all. Do not stand there and pretend you know a language you picked up from watching cartoons. Another guest, the hedge fund manager, scoffed audibly. Is she seriously trying to play lawyer right now? This is absurd. Sterling, have her removed. I'm not playing anything, Alara said, her gaze unwavering, though her heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. I'm telling the truth. A deep, blotchy red flush crept up Sterling's neck, a visible sign of his loss of control. Get back to the kitchen. Now, he snarled. Or you are finished here. Do you understand me? Alara's eyes didn't move from her target. She didn't look at the other angry, dismissive faces. She looked past Sterling's towering, furious form, her gaze meeting the calm, intelligent eyes of Mr. Akira Sato. It was a silent appeal, a direct communication that bypassed the bully in the room. And in that moment, the air in the room shifted. The delicate balance of power, so carefully constructed by Sterling Thorne, had just been upended. Because one voice, spoken at the right moment with the quiet conviction of truth, can cut through power and privilege like a diamond through glass. And this woman, this server, this invisible somebody, she was no longer invisible. The room held its breath. Sterling was still fuming, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. She's out of line. He barked at the restaurant manager, who had appeared at the door, his face a mask of pure terror. Someone remove her. But Mr. Sato had not moved. He sat with his hands folded neatly on the table, his eyes calm but intensely focused. He tilted his head slightly, studying Alara not with judgment or annoyance or even surprise, but with a profound and unnerving curiosity. Then he spoke. His voice was gentle, and he spoke in formal, elegant Japanese, a language that instantly excluded Sterling and his cohort from the conversation. Oju-san, nani o yomaremashita ka? Oju-san, nani o yomaremashita ka? Young lady, what exactly did you read? This was the moment, the precipice her grandfather had always spoken of, the point where you either retreat into the safety of silence or you step forward into the vast, terrifying uncertainty of truth. Alara inhaled slowly, a breath that seemed to draw strength from the very air around her. She bowed her head respectfully toward Mr. Sato, a gesture of deep cultural understanding that was not lost on him. Then she answered, in the same fluent, formal Japanese, her pronunciation crisp and clear. Shirei itashimasu, Sato-sama. Kono giman o mushi suru koto wa dekimasen. Shitsure itashimasu, Sato-sama. Kono giman o mushi suru koto wa dekimasen. Excuse my impertinence, Mr. Sato. I cannot ignore this deception. The effect was instantaneous and electric. The translator, Julian, looked as if the floor had been ripped out from under him. A low, strangled sound escaped his throat. Sterling's lawyers froze, their mouths slightly agape as they exchanged panicked glances. Sterling's face cycled through a rapid succession of emotions, from raw anger to utter confusion, and finally, to a dawning, horrified disbelief. He could not understand the words, but he understood the meaning perfectly. Alara continued, her tone modest but unshakable. The clause in paragraph 7, she said, gesturing again toward the document that lay between them like a sleeping snake. It states that in the event of a 5% market fluctuation, all of Nakamura Holdings' assets on U.S. soil will transfer into the administrative control of Maxwell Capital. She paused, letting the full weight of her words settle into the stunned silence. That is not a partnership, that is a seizure. Mr. Sato raised a single eyebrow. It was the only outward sign of his reaction, but it was enough. Sterling finally found his voice, sputtering in English. She's lying. It's a trick. She's trying to show off. She can't possibly... But Mr. Sato raised a hand. It was a small, quiet motion, a gesture of almost regal authority, yet it silenced the raging billionaire instantly. The power in the room, once so firmly in Sterling Thorne's grasp, no longer belonged to him. It now belonged to Alara Vance and the undeniable truth she had just unleashed. The velvet curtain had risen, and the ugly reality behind the stage was now visible for all to see. Silence fell again, but this time it was different. It was not the silence of luxury or decorum. It was the heavy, charged silence that comes right before the ground splits open. Sterling Thorne's face had gone pale, a stark, chalky contrast to the crimson rage of moments before. His usual smirk, a permanent fixture, was gone, replaced by a twisted mask of desperation. The conqueror was suddenly, shockingly, on the verge of being conquered. "This is nonsense," he spat, his voice sharp and venomous as he scrambled to regain control. He turned his glare on his translator, the man he had bought and paid for. "Julian, tell them. Tell everyone the translation is accurate, that she's twisting the language for attention." All eyes in the room landed on Julian, a man in his 30s who now looked 10 years older. He was sweating profusely through the collar of his expensive shirt, his hands trembling at his sides. His mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air, but no sound came out. He was trapped between the terrifying rage of the man who had bribed him and the quiet, immovable truth that now stood before him. "Julian," Sterling snapped, his voice cracking with a frantic, ugly fury. "Say it, right, now." Julian swallowed hard, a single bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. The entire room seemed to lean in, waiting for his answer. Finally he spoke, his voice barely a whisper, a sound of utter defeat. I can't." "What do you mean you can't?" Sterling hissed, taking a threatening step toward him. Julian's voice broke completely, the words tumbling out in a rush of miserable confession. "She's right." A collective gasp, soft but audible, rippled through the table. Mr. Sato did not flinch. He simply waited, his calm demeanor making the unfolding drama even more potent. Julian continued, each word heavier than the last, as if he were pulling them from the depths of his soul. He no longer looked at Sterling, but directly at Mr. Sato, his eyes filled with a miserable shame. "Mr. Thorne, he paid me $20,000 to modify the Japanese version. He said it was just a precaution, a formality. He assured me that your side wouldn't check it closely, that the English version was what really mattered." He took a shaky breath. "I am so sorry. I knew it was wrong, but I needed the money." Sterling exploded. "You coward! You spineless worm! You were paid to protect our interests. Do you have any idea what I'm going to do to you? You will never work in this city again." But for once, Sterling's rage didn't land. No one was listening to him anymore. His threats were the impotent howls of a king who had just been dethroned. The illusion had been shattered, the magician's trick revealed. The room full of powerful investors and executives had seen the deception for what it was. Not a shrewd business plan, but pure, unadulterated greed dressed in expensive tailoring. Mr. Sato turned his gaze back to Alara. His tone was even, almost soft. "You spoke when others stayed silent," he said, switching back to English, for the benefit of the entire room. "That is not weakness, that is honor." Sterling tried one last, desperate time, his voice pleading. "Akira, wait, please. This is all just a misunderstanding. It's overblown. We can fix this. Just give me a chance to explain." But Mr. Sato had already risen from his chair. He was not interested in explanations. He was interested in the truth, and he had already heard it from the only voice in the room that mattered. He walked slowly around the table, his movements deliberate and dignified. He did not walk towards the door, but towards Alara. The quiet authority of his posture made the cavernous room feel small and intimate. He stopped a few feet away from her, and in a gesture that stunned the onlookers, he bowed his head respectfully. "May I ask?" he said gently, his voice filled with a new, personal curiosity. "Who taught you my language so well?" Alara smiled, a small, genuine smile that finally reached her eyes, chasing away the fear. "My grandfather," she replied, her voice soft. "He fought in the war, in the Pacific." Mr. Sato nodded slowly, his eyes distant, as if a memory had just stepped forward out of the mists of time. "Your grandfather. He must be a very wise man. May I ask his name?" "Samuel Vance," she said, the name catching in her throat for a moment with a surge of love and pride. A long pause followed. The air in the room was thick with unspoken history. "My own grandfather, Mr. Sato said quietly, his voice now imbued with a deep, resonant emotion, was a young conscript during that war. He only ever told one story from that time. It was of an American soldier who saved him, pulled him from the wreckage of a collapsed farmhouse after an attack, shared his water and a small piece of chocolate. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a small, time-worn photograph, carefully folded in a silk cloth. He unfolded it with the reverence of a sacred rite. "This is that soldier," he said, handing the faded, sepia-toned photograph to Alara. She looked down, and a sharp, audible gasp escaped her lips. Her hand flew to her mouth. There, in stark black and white, was a young black man in a dusty American uniform, his face weary but kind, sitting beside a wounded Japanese soldier. They both looked exhausted, but they were smiling faintly, but undeniably, and she recognized that face instantly. The strong jawline, the calm, compassionate eyes. It was her grandfather. "That's him," she whispered, her fingers trembling as she held the impossible relic. "That's Samuel." "Mister." Sato bowed his head again, deeper this time, a gesture of profound respect that spanned generations. "Then today," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "my family finally repays a 70-year debt." And in that moment, the room, the deal, the $500 million, it all faded into insignificance. It was no longer about business. It was no longer about betrayal. It was about legacy. Two families, once connected by a singular act of compassion in the midst of a brutal war, now reunited by a singular act of courage in a room built on lies. The fallout was not a storm. It was a tidal wave, silent and utterly devastating. Sterling Thorne had built an empire on the perception of confidence, charm, and absolute control. But on that night, all three abandoned him. As Mr. Sato walked away from the table, taking his honor and his $500 million investment with him, the deal died publicly, completely, and without a whisper of hesitation. The other guests, once so eager to shake Sterling's hand and toast to his success, now avoided his gaze, fumbling for their phones to call their own brokers, quietly distancing themselves from the radioactive contamination of his disgrace. The story broke within 48 hours. It started not with an official press release, but with a leak. An audio recording from one of the guests' phones, a digitally scanned copy of the two-faced contract, sent anonymously to a financial journalist, a full transcript of Alara's quiet, damning words. The Japanese press ran with it first, calling it a disgrace of diplomacy, an insult to the very principles of international business. Then the American media descended like sharks, sensing blood in the water, framing it as a scandal of corporate greed at its most vile and arrogant. The headlines were brutal and relentless. Maxwell Capital CEO accused of fraud in $500 M deal. Waitress exposes international deception in high-stakes dinner. It does not say that, how 5 words from a server brought down a billionaire. The market, which runs on fear as much as it does on figures, reacted instantly. Maxwell Capital's stock plummeted 22% in a single day. Within a week, it had lost nearly half its value, wiping out billions of dollars in shareholder wealth. The board of directors, once Sterling's loyal allies, convened an emergency meeting and, in a unanimous vote born of self-preservation, removed him as CEO. He was escorted from the building he built 2 days later, not with a press conference or a golden parachute, but with a single cardboard box for his personal items. He walked through a silent lobby where, just a week before, people had practically genuflected as he passed. Federal investigators opened a formal inquiry into his foreign business practices. Julian, the translator, facing ruin, cooperated fully with the authorities in exchange for leniency. Internal emails surfaced, confirming the bribe and the explicit intent to deceive. The investors Sterling once called friends were gone. The politicians he hosted at lavish charity dinners stopped returning his calls. Even the Velvet Ivy, the scene of his public execution, quietly and permanently banned his name from their reservation list. He hadn't just lost money. He had lost the one thing money could never buy back: his reputation, his trust, and the precious, carefully crafted illusion of being untouchable. For the first time in years, Alara and her mother, Evelyn, woke up without the cold knot of fear in their stomachs. The eviction notices that had once seemed to loom over their lives like a guillotine were gone. The stack of final notice bills on the kitchen table felt like relics from another life, artifacts of a struggle that was finally over. A week after the story broke, Alara received a personal call from Mr. Sato. It was not from an assistant or a representative, it was the man himself. He thanked her again, his voice warm and sincere, for her courage, for protecting the honor of his family's name, and for embodying the noble spirit of her grandfather, Samuel Vance. Then he made an offer that left her speechless. The Nakamura Foundation, his global nonprofit dedicated to education and cultural preservation, would provide her with a full academic scholarship. Any university in the world, any program she chose. Tuition, housing, living expenses, all of it would be covered. A mind like yours, he said, should be free to learn, not burdened by worry. But that wasn't all. He offered her mother, Evelyn, a position in the Foundation's New York office. It was a full-time role with benefits, working in community outreach, a job that utilized the empathy and strength she had cultivated over a lifetime of quiet resilience. Not as a cleaner, not as support staff, but as a valued member of the team. Evelyn Vance wept when she heard the news. They were tears not of sadness, but of a profound, bone-deep relief. For decades, she had worked to make other people's dreams possible, cleaning their homes and raising their children. Now, for the first time, she was being given the chance to build a future with her daughter, not for someone else, but for themselves. They moved into a new apartment on the Upper West Side. It wasn't flashy or ostentatious, but it was theirs, filled with sunlight and the scent of the herbs Evelyn grew in ceramic pots on their tiny balcony. Alara applied to Columbia University, majoring in international relations. Her application included a personal essay titled Truth in Translation. She was accepted. On a quiet Sunday morning, a few months later, Alara sat alone on that small balcony, a cup of tea warming her hands. The city buzzed below, a constant symphony of life and ambition. She held the photograph Mr. Sato had given her, its edges soft and worn with the passage of 70 years. She looked at the image of the two young men who should have been enemies, but who, in one fleeting moment, in the ruins of a war-torn world, chose to be brothers. From that single act of kindness decades ago, everything had followed. A family saved, a legacy honored, and a voice hers that had learned the most important lesson of all. Honor, she realized, is not about titles or wealth or contracts printed on thick, expensive paper. Honor is what you do when no one is watching. It is speaking up because the truth matters more than your comfort. It is helping someone, not because it benefits you, but because it is right. That is what Samuel Vance had taught her. That is what her mother had lived by. And that is what Alara Vance had chosen to carry forward. In a world that would still try to underestimate the young, black, working-class woman, she had not shouted to be heard. She had simply told the truth. And she had let the truth do the talking. That truth had destroyed a billionaire's empire and built a new future for her family. And it served as a quiet, powerful reminder, a modern fable for a noisy world. Sometimes, the most earth-shattering force is not a storm, but the quietest voice, speaking the truth in a room full of lies.